1AC. Now, the second argument of the 1AC is concedes the top version of the app, which solves our precision argument. The only answer was the PICS discussion. Concedes the nuance of our entire argument. Failure to specifically stamp the bill means that restriction is null and void because presidential stretching and T declare anyone gives them authorization. Consistency and concession of 2 chromatic evidence is killer. The closer the farther the plaintiff's attempt to explicitness actually makes it worse. First, against all authority related to targeted killing also means that they have an answer to the counterplay. New provisions ensure that he is not restricted because it can call upon previous statutes. As means the circumvent A means that there's no dissent on based on the PICS argument because the act always gets assaulted of the core of the topic. They have to see the reason the topic exists because the executive already circumvents congressional authority when must be able to have check on that. Let's go. The second argument is the act is within the AUMF is good as an answer to the PIC, which means they always have an anti-text argument. Just because someone says AUMF does not mean you have an answer. Does not mean you're dead. RC PICs are devil numbers of offense means all your interpretation and encourages better plain text writing. Cross does it now. A couple of arguments here. They have conceded the topic the way of topic version of the affirmative. They can just stamp the AUMF, which means that all their reasonability arguments as well as their defensive arguments do not apply. The only reason you can get rid of authority because also concedes a permutation between the interpretation because it is possible to say that authority is a permission to do something and also concede the concession of Taylor evidence. The Taylor evidence is crucial here and the context of the permutation because our argument is that the authorization must come from a principal agent. They concede previous Bradley evidence as well as Cronin evidence as well as period Myers evidence and indicate that the principal agent in the context of war powers authority is statute delegation as opposed to the Constitution. And that means that the affirmative leads to a conflation between the two of them. They concede that this is supposed to limit because it allows them to not specify, which means that even if their act is something that is reasonable because they met their interpretation is supposed to make it allows the commander-in-chief taking authority, which is not something to be delegated. Now, the second argument I'm going for here is the concession of the Brown and Jeremy Thomas evidence. I made this pretty damn clear across examination when I was going for this argument. Restriction on is not the same as to restrict. To restrict means to make something harder. I.e., if you give someone a backpack in a race, to restrict them within that race. A restriction on is who can enter the race. Restriction number 2, restrict them to a targeted killing authority means that makes it harder to do so. Something like defunding would become topical under their interpretation as opposed to eliminating his authority to do so in the first place. They don't even meet a restricted interpretation conceded in the 1AR. His only answer was reasonability that you can arrive at anyway. The affirmative plaintext writing, plaintext the vacuum answer. There's a couple of arguments here. First, says cross-examination checks, gets a couple of arguments. Cross-examination means that the affirmative gets to be able to spike out of every single link because they can clarify and the choice because they say we know what our act meant to say, therefore we don't get dissent. 2, their PICS arguments means movement 1 that destroys negative ground also means that they will always have specific links so they can clarify later. And the debate cross-examination is because we assume better form plaintext writing. We also see the precision argument. Precision and plaintext writing means that they are created better form of education because it allows us to understand the core controversy of the topic internally in terms of their warranty argument because we are the only ones who are driving this as a separation of power to me because it determines the distinction between energy powers and war powers authority, which means that precision argument solves our Justice Breyer evidence says that originating statute is the origination of the president because Congress has denied the president authority. Limits that certain statutes enacted by Congress have placed the president's authority or Bradley's evidence of war power authority is constitutional constitutional law approved restrictions are placed on the originating statute by Congress and enforced by the court statutes that are concrete and predictable. They've also conceded that our interpretation accounts for both topic mechanism. Coherence is a prerequisite. Reject their interpretation because any interpretation does not allow for substantially between both topics. Being able to go a coherent mechanism means that you should vote negative because it does not provide a cogent thought for what the affirmative means. There's a couple of research arguments answer the reasonability claim first is they explode limits for the negative. Our arguments about precision means that we'd never be able to get links to the affirmative because they would always be able to clarify in the 2AC out of what our links to arguments are. They conceded if we are correct that it should be based on statutory limits, that means that all negative research should be directed at challenging the statutes, which means we don't get any of the link arguments based on the research that we've done prior to the round because they simply remove that. Also means that the commander-in-chief exposed the topic that was all above makes it possible to be negative because research learned are what get internally to education, which means that internally turns to education claim because if we do the wrong research or our research is rendered null and void by the interpretation of the 1AC or the act of the 1AC, that means that the plain text should be the focus of a plain text in a vacuum is key name of stable as graphic is the only stable authority that's a stable synthesis of what their argument is. Cross-examination can also shift between debates, which means that the wiki is determined by the plain text because it does not answer to ask them questions on the wiki. Now, instead of Chrono 12 episodes, different restrictions are inaccurate. Only stamping statutes were written can clearly limit authority. The plain is not explicit. Only about their intent does not mean the plain text accomplishes goal. Hence our entire topic vagueness and exposed in this context that was above as well as the second piece of chrono guidance. Also, they can see this concept of fiat and cross-examination don't make that topical and only encourages better plain text writing. We all have well-meaning intentions to get away to political reality. Congress uses ambiguous legislative language presidents interpret to fit their purposes, which means circumvention is a dissent to any of the counterplays or things that we read against them, which means that they have a built-in answer if we are correct about the topic. No, and interpretation of war power authority and the context of the Constitution relative to statutes means that there's game over for the negative. Now Taylor can see the negative evidence because that was about the principal agent. They've also seen the principal agent for war powers authority is not the Constitution but is statute, which means that even if they're correct that the AUMF is the only thing they have to derive authority from, we are always able to pass vague bills. The second argument they conceded is the closer or the farther you are because of the fact that it's clearly delegated in the AUMF. The fact that they do not mention the AUMF is going to be the circumvent that the president uses to get out of the restriction of the authority, because it says that it's clearly not referencing the statute that gives him authority. It is separate, therefore he's still granted authority by the AUMF, which means that only statement the bill is able to solve are internally to limit arguments on what considered that our education, which means that there's no just another interpretation of the plain language begets authorization. Related legislation sparks confusion. That's the chronon. And the statutory amendment is always possible topical. As our cartograph, which means that the way of conceded, topical versus the affirmative, no risk of any sort of dissent, that all the reasonability arguments are defensive claims. What? They say after that ways. After that ways, but one for example, that conceded a couple of arguments first is that we have the holistic scope that allows for both judicial and congressional restriction. It also means that you are able to narrow your scope between the congressional limitations. Restrictions that there are a large number of statutes upon which you can place a ruling in the affirmative, especially in the context of all 4 areas of the resolution, means that there's already sufficient background that burden outweighs.
How much y'all have?
157. Now I'm going to go back.
Here, give me your road rankings.
Is it over?
No, I'm scared to be there.
Oh, wrong Kennedy. Mistake.
Kirsch and who's not. Oh, Kirsch and you ginger who's not Shelby.
But still ginger.
It's still a ginger. So it's still a soulfish, it's not the other space.
Who'd you vote for in your last?
1,000.
Oh yeah, I was gonna talk about that later.
I was gonna guess you were gonna vote I wasn't following that closely.
Kind of. The 2 arrows are very good.
I like that you were coordinating today.
Yeah, the 1 arrow was pretty good. That was my thought.
Their app is, they talked a lot about Sapphire, which I believe is like a literary character. And they said that they
It's
asserted,
a trope.
okay, well,
It's
fair
a
enough.
stereotype about black women.
They asserted the like Sapphires and war powers against the president's war powers. And they're sort of like, we're going to use our condition of enforced visibility to declare war, and we're rational. And,
Oh, okay. Yeah, they did the same declare war against Emory Surrender Act this morning, or that's what I watched the
Right.
last.
So they were,
They said, everyone's declared war, it's also what the light is doing.
right?
Apparently that's super angry.
You good?
Yeah, apparently he ran over just like off the chain, like super yelling at everybody, like tree skeptic at ground one, which is like, he was like, they have more skill and process than they've ever done before. He was like, they're pissed. I was like,
Right.
awesome, that sounds like lots of fun, let's do that.
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah, well, I mean, but.
Bye-bye. Where's Max?
He's right behind me. He took longer washing his hands.
That fucker.
I know, right? Also, can we refer to him by his real name, Shelby?
Shelby, you're taking it on.
Good. This is why you're so high on him?
The empty gingerfire. Not good though. I knew you before I knew Shelby, so you have a much more concrete reality as me. Okay, what do you got? Okay.
Reasonability is gonna be the top.
Frank.
Are we good?
Reasonability should be the lens which you evaluate their offense, error affirmative on T, even if they win some, risk of their offense, not vote negative unless they win. We have made it impossible to debate. The reasonability argument was conceded in the block, which premised the 1AR strategy on how Miles covered the K versus the top county argument. All of the new 2-in-1 responses that have been application should be cross-struck from your flow because it makes it impossible to be affirmative. There are 3 unique reasons why this means they cannot win this debate. Ace of point is structural advantages. T is a no risk option. They can always arbitrarily move the goalpost to exclude us and be 1% more limiting. It's hard for us to get any offense proven by the huge bias of voting negative on top county in general and the cult of limits. B support is offense defense paradigm should not apply here because we have a weak need argument and cross-X checks etc. But defense to all of theirs, they shift the goalpost and proven by the 1 and T start stringing together these random definitions of quantity of war powers authority versus the number. They also can see the bottom of the 1AR argument about substance crowd, which is the unique reason why they make T a strategy rather than a limiting interpretation, which should not be its use. It should be a check on abuse, which they have not isolated in this debate, which is the key argument. They have no potential to be abuse argument, which means that you have to evaluate whether or not this debate was impossible for the negative, and it clearly wasn't. See some point is competing interpretations, i.e., what they would have to defend are equally arbitrary because they rely upon judges reading and granting interpretations of random definitions, so you should default to whether or not it was impossible for them to be negative, which I think we will clearly prove it is not. The best piece of offense in the 1 AR was the one the negative did not respond to the best. Their ground evidence says that, quote, the scope of the president's independent war powers is notoriously unclear. That means that their interpretation requires arbitrarily forcing the affirmative to include the statute in the plan. The framing of the 2 NR is exactly why allowing these T arguments are stupid. His only answer to our best piece of offense is just, quote, no offense, put it in the plan. The negative will always be able to find a random JD candidate like Cronin who with no intent to define that murders the ability for the affirmative to generate offenses. They will always have a slightly more interpreting and limiting definition. The app is reasonable. His cross-site application to this argument doesn't make any sense. We do create a massive restriction on targeted killing authority, which proves that they get DAs for drones good, etc. They had no ground or limits, ground loss in this debate. It does not have to be the AUMF, which will be explained below. We did not concede topical version. You have all of Miles' work in the 1 AR about how the topical version has a massive DA with the PICS argument, as well as why the T version is just a specification with all our defense below proves that it wasn't conceded. The statutory amendment argument that their evidence cites is bad interpretation for debate because it means that the negative does things like they conceded pick out of the AUMF and read a stupid politics language, which means that affirmative functionally can never win that debate unless he says that we can say AUMF good, yeah, but the negative will always innovate ahead of the affirmative and they force us to do that.
The argument was that if we have to spec the AUMF in the plan, the counterplan to repeal it is competitive and then do the same thing with the different statute.
Yeah, also the AUMF good does not actually respond because they can repeal it, they can have kind of other repeals and then do something with a different statute, which is all their circumvention arguments below. The key argument on this part of the debate is null and void does not make any sense. Those 2AC and 1 AR say all of our solvency cards just say increased restrictions is sufficient. The current evidence as well as the 1AC evidence says that is sufficient to solve the case. So the null and void argument doesn't make any sense. The key distinction is they are the ones who are mixing burdens in this debate. All of their arguments are like the executive will be more likely to circumvene. Yeah, that's a solvency argument they should get, or a DA they should get, not a topicality argument. So that totally disproves the classic logic of topicality. It proves our reasonability arguments because the negative arbitrarily moves the goalpost to make T a strategy rather than just going for the awesome solvency argument they could have had in this debate. We did not concede the permutation. We have impact on their interpretation. The Taylor evidence says yes, that principal agent gives authority, but they have no reverse causal evidence that says that principal has to be the one that takes that authority away. They've also conceded the 1 AR argument that we are not commander-in-chief authority. We are the only way to interpret the plan is AUMF authority, which means that they could have brought a DA based on what the plan would have to change because it is targeted killing, which comes from the 2001 AUMF, which solves their ground arguments because they can read those type of DAs and that affirmative would have to defend them. Restriction has some restrict first restriction debate. Their card does not make the clear enough distinction. Our global evidence in the 2AC answers this and says that they have the same definition, i.e. restricting the president's war-making authority is a restriction on his war-making authority. They also do not impact this independently of the rest of the debate. So if we win the DAs that I will vote for below or reasonability, you should vote for that. Cross-ex checks most of their offense because the clarification later doesn't make any sense because the cross-ex is binding. The precision argument also doesn't make any sense because the plan should not be necessarily the final bill, but it does provide some ground for the negative.
Congress should defund the AUMF, which proves that it's not independently impacted and links all their offense.
Congress should defund the
Could defund it.
Yeah, Congress should defund the AUMF, which proves it's not independently impacted and links all their offense. We solve coherence because the affirmative can be the affirmative plan text in a vacuum is interpreted in a coherent manner. If you read it, it is clearly coherent in what it would do for the president's war-making authority. We do not explode limits. There's no 2AC clarification and no in-round abuse. The negative research is clearly not about statutes. They've now again shifted the frame from the negative research all depends on SOP to now the negative research all depends on statutes. SOP is the DA they would get as well as all the other negative generics, which is why affirmative ground outweighs negative ground. The PICS, etc., would slay the app. The negatives have generics, critiques, politics, etc., and the negative block, which overwhelms the advantage. There's no internal link term to education. Seriously, the app bans TK authority, and they read 0 DAs in the 1 and T, which proves that they are shifting the goalpost in order to win. The wiki argument doesn't make any sense because this was a new plan. The plan vagueness argument does not make any sense because there's no metric for doing that. And circumvention is only impact. This is a solvency argument, not a T argument. The closer, further distinction also does not make much sense because the solvency argument, they can get that case argument that we go closer, and that's not relevant. The big DA is the conflation of terms that they do, which causes worse picks for the affirmative. The affirmative will not win any of those debates, whereas the negative can, which means it's not impossible.
debate.
Here you go, this is all set.
Thank you.
I think I already have all the cards, I'm gonna go get food before we start.
Makes sense.
I get it, but no reason. Yeah.
Just well,
I know, but as it gets closer to the end, then you have less time.